These are stories about matriarchy, so we both will get to know what it's all about. This comes from Tierra del Fuego, from the Yamana. And the origin of the Kina. In the beginning, women had sole power. They gave orders to the men, who obeyed just as women do today. The men took care of the children, tended the fire, cleaned the skins, while the women did no work at all. That was the way it was always to be. The women invented the great Kina hut and everything which goes on inside it, and then fooled the men into thinking they were spirits. They stepped out of the great hut, painted all over with masks on their heads. The men did not recognize their wives, who, simulating the spirits, beat the earth with dried skins so that it shook. Their howls and roars so frightened the men they hid in their huts. But one day, the Sun Man, whose job it was to supply meat to the women spirits in their hut, overheard the voices of two girls while he was passing a lagoon. Furious, he hid in the bushes and saw the girls practicing their spirit impersonations and washing off paint. He confronted them, insisting they reveal their secrets. Finally, they confessed. It's the women themselves who paint themselves and put on masks. Then they step out of the hut and show themselves to the men. There are no other spirits there. The Sun Man returned to the men and exposed the fraudulent women. In revenge, the men stormed the Kina hut and in the ensuing great battle, killed the women or turned them into animals. From that time on, the men have performed in the Kina hut. They do this in the same manner as the women before them. Sacred flutes, the origins of, from the Amazon. 3 women walking through the forest long ago, they heard music coming from a lagoon. They investigated and caught 3 fish, which turned into 3 sacred flutes. The women played these to produce music so powerful they were enabled to occupy the sacred men's house, forcing the men to live in ordinary dwellings. While the women did little but play on their flutes all day long, they forced the men to make manioc flour, fetch the water, firewood, and care for the children. The men's ignominy was complete. When the women visited the men's dwellings at night, they forced their sexual attentions on them, just as we do today. However, the flutes needed feeding with meat. One day, the men, who were the hunters, threatened to withhold what they caught unless the women surrendered the flutes. Frightened of angering the fertility spirits contained in the flutes, the women agreed. The men seized the flutes and the power which they've held to this day. And more in the Amazon, origins of the bull roarer. Once again, men doing the jobs of the women, women letting their side down somehow, and the men hearing their secrets, grabbing hold of the bull roarers. Move over to New Guinea, same ideas. Origins of the bull roarer. Actually, it's even more graphic in New Guinea. Where does the bull roarer actually come from? Where does it get hidden? It's up a woman's vagina, and as soon as a man is able to trick a bird to find that bull roarer, the sacred instrument, the bird pulls it out, and the woman has her first menstrual flow. The huts of the sacred lodges, the secrets of the Ida, these belong to the women. The men went hunting and they killed so much meat, they fed it to the women so that they were so stuffed full, they all fell over backwards and exposed their genitals, and then the men discovered the secrets and copulated with them, were able to screw them. While the women slept, the men were able to steal all the masks for the sacred enclosure. And the women said, oh no, we're no good. We fell asleep. From now on, the Ida belongs to the men. It goes on and on. We've got other from Papua New Guinea, from the Gimi, more sacred flutes under the bark screen skirts, sacred flutes that when the men steal them, they no longer play properly. It's necessary to blow very hard. The flutes should be able to play by themselves. But once the men have got them, they can't play by themselves anymore. The woman who originally caught the moon in a net, and her moon gets stolen by the men, and the moon is reflected in this great red leeches of sago. And I was then going to move lastly to Africa well, not lastly necessarily, but to Africa, where another of these so-called matriarchy myths, the stories of when women ruled, and of all the terrible trickery and evil things that women did. And because of those evil things, it was righteous and just that the men should take up the secrets, take over the sacred instruments, and then they behaved in a kind of queer sexual reversal. They behaved in all the ways that those bad women had done. It's kind of legitimation. And let's hear it from the Hadza, the people that I've worked with who are hunter-gatherers, Tanzania. Most of the other groups I've talked about have been horticultural or tending to... They've got some fur hunting, but also horticultural. But the Hadza are purely hunter-gatherers, bow and arrow hunter-gatherers. And the item of contest is the secrets of Epeme. And originally, the origin of Epeme belonged to Mambedako, who was the woman with the zebra's penis, which is what this is all about. Long ago, Epeme, meat, used to belong to the women. So Epeme is special meat that comes from certain parts of the animal. The owner of the pot in which Epeme meat was cooked was an old woman called Mambedako. She dressed like a man, with a wild catskin in front and with her buttocks naked. Under the wild catskin, she tied the penis of a zebra. She was married, beautiful wives, used to have intercourse with them using the zebra penis. She had a man's bow and used to hunt. She only hunted male zebra. When she killed one, she cut off its penis and tied it onto herself. When men hunted and killed an animal, the epeme was cut off and carried to the hut of Mambedako. She took out her pot and went with the meat to the women's meeting place. There the women ate the meat. The men stayed at home, had no share in the epeme meat. Now then the story portrays a revolution by men. We would say counter-revolution. But the men gang together against this monstrous woman, Mambedako, who's ruling all the women, and threaten her, actually do punish her with a terrible humiliation and violation, which is said to be the actual punishment that would be applied to any woman who threatened to come across or interrupt men's secret epeme feasts. In the secret epeme feasts, men are keeping the pot of epeme meat that they're supposed to give to God. They're supposed to, epeme is actually a name for God. The meat is sacred, but actually they're guzzling it themselves. But if any woman came across that, she would be subject to horrible punishment, really gang rape, all kinds of nasty things done, sexual humiliation done to her. And this is portrayed in the story, so that the rule of women is brought to an end by that violent humiliation of Mambedako. Since that time, epeme meat's been the property of the man. And I'm going to come back as well to an Australian story. But let's just consider these stories. Of course, Backhofen, the author, the German, who's a lawyer but anthropologist, who studied classical sources, drawing on these kinds of materials from classical sources, literate sources, of stories of women once ruling. And this theme is quite powerful in Greek literature, in many of the plays that have ritual structures. You can think of the Athenian comedies like Aristophanes, which made fun of the idea that women once ruled a gynocracy, a kind of theme of gynocracy. And that Mutarek source, with the idea that there was an earlier stage of matriarchy, matrimonial priority, matriarchy because men didn't know who the babies were. There was no way of knowing with an early stage of sexual promiscuity, who is the father of who. Therefore, descent was passed through mother right, inheritance and descent. People belonged to clans delineated by their relationships in the female line. This has been, for many radical feminists in the 60s, 70s kind of time period of the sort of wake-up of radical feminism, when many radical feminists also explored the literature of Engels and Marxism. This was a question: is this something real, or is this a fantasy, a particularly lurid male fantasy for justification and legitimation of the way that women are treated in all these different societies, South America, New Guinea, plus many others across the world? Particularly Joan Bamberger, who was writing as one of the sort of radical feminist anthropologists in the early 70s, asking, is this primitive matriarchy purely a myth? And she discounted any idea that the sort of Backhofen type of source of mythology, basically ideological sources which outlined women's rule, to be anything except something poetic, something which was outlining sort of sources of myth as social charter. If they ever existed, if matriarchies ever existed, she said, well, there's absolutely no proof about it. There's no evidence either way that there's an original state of society being matrilineal or an original state being patrilineal, patriarchal. But even if the myths weren't historic, they still have a great deal of significance. They're still very significant as something, as a matter, as a social phenomenon to be analysed. So the issue for her was not whether women actually held political power in some distant past, but why do the myths keep on saying so? She's arguing. And she analyses them very much in the spirit of Malinowski. We'll come back to Malinowski, who saw mythologies in a very functional way as a kind of social charter, telling people either what to do or what not to do, or what was expected in terms of social experience. The main argument, as she looks at the way that the myths are specially associated to initiation lodges, secret lodges, particularly of male initiates, that they use to justify those secret lodges, which give men a privileged and exalted position in terms of the division of labour, in terms of access to food, just in terms of sheer political authority. So all kinds of sacred flutes, sacred paraphernalia, bull roarers, and the structure of the stories, a chaotic original time period, often a very unspecified time period. Women ruled, they had an invention of some ritual trickery or secrets, and then this power gets completely reversed and overthrown. And that establishes a hidebound sex division of labour with women doing all the dirty jobs, men having sort of, when they want to, when they feel like it, they might go hunting, but even then they get the best of the meat. And women lose their sons. The sons go across to the men. Pretty much it's got a patrilineal at least, patrilogical logic. And but it is very interesting that this sexual theme of reversal is there. Men used to have breasts and suckle the babies, and that gets changed over to women then now. So everything that was natural, it seems to have been culturally reversed in the original situation. Okay, that was a sort of radical feminist anthropologist view of it, Joan Bamberger's idea about those matriarchy stories. But then we've had a big Marxist fight back on that, and I'll, from, of course, Chris, and I'll say something about what Chris has said about these stories. Instead of, where Bamberger said, no, we can't take them as history, I don't think Chris is saying that the stories are a literal historic depiction of what has happened in particular groups at all. But he is saying that if you take the collectivity of those stories across continents, cross-culturally, they are corresponding to this very specific structure that can be decoded. It's a structure that has a quite definite commonality to it, that can be decoded, and which is sending us a message. It is basically a scientific message that's coming to us out of those cultures. And it is saying something about the origins of human society. What are the common themes? There's sacred lodges, sacred knowledge, associated to these noise-making instruments, the big bull roarers or the flutes. The lunar themes associated with blood and wetness, paint or dyes or colour, usually red, masquerade. The question of who eats the meat, who's got the right to the meat, which direction should the meat travel in, from which sex to which sex, and the issue of sexual reversal. All of these as kind of common factors to a lot of these stories. The key, perhaps that sexual reversal, and most especially a phenomenon which comes if these stories, these myths, regularly associate themselves to initiation, they do in the Hadza case that I know about, the Hadza matriarchy myth there, Verpene, they associate both to a young man's, a young hunter's initiation, but also to a young woman's initiation. It's kind of interpreted differently according to whether it's men's side or women's side of the story. And the kind of phenomenon or aspect that it is very, very difficult for Joan Bamberger, with her interpretation, to understand is a phenomenon that I've shown an image of here before, but I'm not going to actually do it again because it's a bit offensive to Aboriginal tradition. It is the phenomenon of things like male menstruation. If truly, if the origin of the original mechanisms and way of expressing and manifesting ritual power, which the stories tell us about, is this painting and masquerade with the masks and trickery, something that's a coded reference to a ritually synchronized menstruation, well, truly indeed, there are many examples from Australia, from New Guinea, from South America, and probably ancient examples that could be dug out of classical literature for our continent, particularly not only classical literature, but of course fairy tales like Jack and the Beanstalk, or tales like that, where men are made to bleed and must bleed either explicitly from the genitals or else in other ways, nose bleeding and various sorts. Now, it's very hard for Bamberger to kind of explain that bit if she's just saying, well, this is only legitimation of male bad behaviour and the way that they treat women today. What is going on? And I think this is one of the things that first of all woke up Chris to the sort of the sequence of of strategies that must be have happened in the evolution of human society and the human revolution. Why are men doing menstruation? It doesn't seem to make out that there has been always an all-powerful kind of phallocracy of male patriarchy all the way down the line from the very beginnings of time, if somehow to assert their legitimate authority and assume ritual authority, they must be doing some form of menstruation, dressed up in all kinds of paraphernalia, telling quite extraordinary stories about the original power of women. One of the most extraordinary of these, I'm going to just tell you the story, it's a story everybody should know anyway, the story of the two Wawalak sisters. At the beginning of time, two sisters I should say, it's coming from northeast Arnhem Land in Australia. So this is the continent of hunter-gatherers. The story of the two Wawalak sisters. At the beginning of time, two sisters were travelling across the landscape, conferring names on the features of a previously unnamed world. One carried a child, the other was pregnant. They'd both committed incest in their own country, the country of the Wawalak. Carrying spears and other symbols of masculine power, they carried food and hunted game animals, prophesying that everything they collected would soon become mareng, sacred or to be. At last, having traversed many countries, they arrived at a waterhole in which, unknown to them, dwelt the great rock python or rainbow serpent, which is male in some versions, female in others, or kind of dual sex often. This serpent was a kinsperson to the sisters, so it's again incestuous that she's kin. As the pregnant sister felt she was about to give birth, the other sister began to help her. They camped by the waterhole and lit a fire on which to cook their gathered food and game. As the sister, helped by her companion, began to give birth, afterbirth blood began flowing into the sacred pool, polluting it and arousing the snake. A rain cloud, lightning flashes and a rainbow appeared in the sky. The serpent was emerging in anger from its hole, unleashing the season of rains, floods and storms. The night was dark except for the thin curve of the moon. As the women's genital blood flowed, all cooking fire became suddenly ineffective. The animals and plants which the women had hunted and gathered refused to cook, jumped up alive from the fire on which they'd been placed, and dived like men, into the nearby blood-streaked waterhole. The well waters began to rise. Go away, the sisters cried as they became aware of the immense snake in the sky. Seized with fear, they danced to make the snake go away. But the dancing only brought on the second sister's menstrual flow, attracting the serpent still more. The waterhole began overflowing, flooding the dry land all around. Now, filled with foreboding and despair, the sisters fled into the little parturition or menstrual hut that they'd built. But at this point, inside the hut, they were both shedding blood. And as they sang out the words, Yulungur and menstrual blood, the most taboo potent of the songs known to them, the angry serpent thrust its nose into the hut and swallowed the women and children alive. Black clouds now blotted out the sky, and rain crashed down in a terrible storm. As the waters enveloped the women and their babies, they bled still more and began undergoing a change of name, moving into another realm beyond death. At this point, the two sisters had turned into or become the snake. In a voice of thunder, the great snake roared. This was the spirits of the two sisters who were speaking out of his mouth. We are here now, the sisters said. The snake's eaten us. We are the Marien, the sacred knowledge of Witi the snake. Our spirits talk through him for another country. As the snake became erect like a tree, its head stretching high into the clouds, the sisters in this way continued to give names to the world. Snakes from the neighbouring countries joined in the roaring and name-giving, and all together inaugurated the great rituals which today bind in solidarity tribes from far and wide despite their linguistic differences. Okay, well, Chris has done a great deal to analyse the way that Aboriginal men, particularly the older men, as gerontocracy, as a ruling elite in control of younger men, as initiates into the secrets of Wawalak, completely turn inside out the meaning of the sacred knowledge that is incorporated in this Wawalak story. So the interpretation of Rainbow Snake is that it represents this fundamental menstrual ritual solidarity that the sisters possessed, and which they now pass on to men, thanks to a dream that's recounted in the narrative by the men who were talking to Lloyd Warner, who was collecting these stories from the Muangin or Yolngu people. And what happened is, after the events of this mighty snake emerging from the waterhole, its body having crashed down and regurgitated and left the sisters and their children on the ground, which became this great ritual dance ground. Sometime after those events, then two ancestral men appeared at that sacred waterhole and found the two sisters' blood, which were carefully connected in containers, this being ochre, effectively. And then they went to sleep and they dreamed. The sun went down, they left the blood till morning. They slept, and while they were in a deep sleep, they dreamed of what the two women sang and danced when they were trying to keep Yualungur from swallowing them. The Wawalak women came back as spirits and taught the two men. The two sisters said to men, "This is all now. We're giving you this dream so you can remember these important things. You must never forget these things we've told you tonight. You must remember every time for each year these songs and dances. You must paint with blood and feathers for Mandiela, Gunabibi, and Junguan. These are all the great rituals of initiation for the young, for the boys to grow up as men. You must dance all the things we saw and named on our journey, and which ran away into the well, all the animals." So this is a sacred story of creation, of the naming of things. It really corresponds to the story at the beginning of the Bible, of Genesis, of the naming of all the creatures, the formation, the partition of the earth and the waters, and so on, which of course entails a great rainbow and a snake, of course. Okay, in the Wawalaks, in context of the Junguan and the other Muangin rituals, all the songs, dances and blood-shedding operations through which women had conjured up the snake were carefully described to the men, so men could bleed and get themselves ritually swallowed in the same way. Men, therefore, took over, appropriated that ritual solidarity that previously, according to the stories, is the province of women. The men succeeded in memorising the details. They themselves cut themselves, they bled, they synchronised their flows, got themselves swallowed. They died only to come back to life again. They resolved never to forget the secrets they'd learned. And they say, according to Warner's informants, we dance these things now because our Wonga ancestors learned them from the two Wawalak sisters. And they faithfully preserve those rituals to this very day. The last comments again from men of the Yolngu or Mungin group, telling to, this is to Ronald Burnt, another ethnographer of Northeast Arnhem Land, acknowledging straightforwardly, really we have been stealing what belongs to them, meaning women. For it mostly is all women's business. Since it concerns them, it belongs to them. Men have nothing to do, really, except copulate. It belongs to women. All that belonging to those Wawalak, the baby, the blood, the yelling, the dancing, all that concerns the women. That every time we have to trick them. Women can't see what men are doing, though it really is their own business, but we can see their side. This is because all the dreaming business came out of women. Everything. Only men take picture for Yulungo. A picture meaning takes a sort of imitation. Men make an artificial reproduction. In the beginning we had nothing, because men had been doing nothing. We took those things from women. And as Chris says, it's kind of a huge indictment of the way anthropology has been conducted through the 20th century, that anthropologists they can't believe their own ears, what they're hearing from Aboriginal informants who are talking about that actually they might have a scientific, be telling them some scientific information here, that really is historic, if not historic precisely. It's a reconstruction of some real sequence of events. Okay, I was going to, having given you pictures of primitive matriarchy from a very indigenous perspective, that primitive matriarchy appears to be this kind of everything, the world turned upside down, everything that's kind of wrong and bad about men today is that women used to do it and therefore men do it today. All those matriarchs, the Wawalak, are committing sins and crimes in their incest, in their wrong behaviour of doing hunting, which women would be forbidden from doing, in their wrong behaviour of hunting certain totemic species, all kinds of things, and eating species that would be incestuous, totemic to themselves. All of this is wrong. Let's jump back to some of those radical feminists. I want to read something that Jermaine Greer wrote. I don't know when, actually. I'm not sure where this came from. But she's thinking about the concept of matriarchy. And she's also, it's worth remembering, somebody who's got knowledge, quite good knowledge on indigenous Aboriginal Australia, and would have drawn off a lot of their understanding of that. And certainly she has knowledge that for women who do not necessarily come from Western traditions, Judeo-Christian traditions, have many powerful means of asserting their rights. And Greer says, I do think that women could make politics irrelevant by a kind of spontaneous cooperative action, the like of which we've never seen, which is so far from people's ideas of state structure or viable social structure, it seems to them like a total anarchy, when what it really is very subtle forms of interrelation that do not follow some hierarchical pattern, which is fundamentally patriarchal. The opposite to patriarchy is not matriarchy, but fraternity. Yet I think it's women who are going to have to break this spiral of power and find the trick of cooperation. There's a couple of things I like in that quote. The assertion that matriarchy is not the opposite of patriarchy, that it is fundamentally not hierarchical. The choice of the word saying fraternity recalling a liberté, égalité, fraternité in some ways, in the sense that a real revolutionary aspiration. The idea that somehow women become male, as if male, in making those assertions of equality or fraternity. And then that it's a trick. The corporation is somehow something that's playing a trick on everybody concerned, everybody involved. Well, again, Greer is being very abstract. Bamberger, in her approach to the primitive matriarchy stories, she's trying to collect them as a kind of abstract collection from which you can garner some general themes, and she treats them very much as a muchness and says, oh, they're social charters giving male legitimacy. I want to become very concrete and actually show that matriarchy is alive and well and dancing in Central Africa today. Matriarchy and primitive communism in all senses. And show how the women do it. And this is quite good fun. And this comes out of a beautiful article from the latest edition of Radical Anthropology, which we have some copies of at a knockdown, £2, so you're very welcome to get it. And from Morna Finnegan, who analysed ethnographies, a collection of ethnographies on Central African forest people, particularly Michel Kiselyuk's Seize the Dance, and Jerome Lewis's wonderful work on the Elengele. And we're looking at Baka, Central African forest people, their culture, and the assertion of egalitarianism, which is a relationship, not a static and fixed term. So there's continual bargaining and disputation about the degree, the levels of egalitarianism here. Individual autonomy and freedom, as in all hunter-gatherer groups, is prized. So a social ethos of sharing and a perpetual sort of motion against dominance has to be continually reinvented. Every single morning you're getting up, every single evening that there's some food there to be distributed, it's got to be reasserted, it's got to be continually worked at. And this tension is what gives the egalitarian relationship its fluid and dynamic quality. And what Kiselyuk highlights is a concerted sexual teasing with which women's songs occupy themselves. One popular Ding Boku chant, directed at male spectators, cries, "The penis gives birth to nothing, only urine." Another well-known Alamba song, stripped back to its lyrical bare bones, consists of just one word, dumana, which means sex, or actually, Jerome Lewis says what it means is fuck. It's just one single word, kind of over and over. When Kiselyuk relayed these songs to some non-Baka Congolese men, they were horrified that Baka men would put up with such humiliation. So why do Baka men engage with women in a ritual dialogue which assertively undermines their own ability to dominate? So why don't they, respond very aggressively to these deliberate provocations? And Kiselyuk notes that anthropology, actually the literature on gender egalitarianism, there's plenty of literature about egalitarianism, that the way that gender egalitarianism works has been very sorely left understudied. And she describes, so the way they do it is by dancing. Their dances are this negotiation of power between the sexes. In a performance of Dingboku, organised by two experienced dancers, Sandimba and Jongi, two closely entwined lines of 13 women, each including grandmothers and women who have their babies on their backs, open the performance with a rendition of Dumana. So it's literally all these old ladies down to babies and children singing. The two lines of women, each closely interwoven with arms draped over each other's shoulders, move back and forth, stepping rhythmically, moving into a rendition of "The vagina wins." The lines turn to face each other, and with one line moving backwards, they move together like a unit, like a sort of it's a military precision unit across the space. And Sandimba's line circles around at close range to face in the same direction as the other line, only a foot or so between each line, and the women all ran forward together, then backward together, with these mandudu leaves bobbing on their buttocks and dust rising around their tramping feet. And Kiselyuk interprets this as Dingboku as this kind of abstract aesthetic of lovemaking, but there aren't any men or boys there directly involved. It's creating a kind of So who is it that they're lovemaking to? The Yaka believe it is the beauty of women's polyphonic song and the eroticism of the collective movement that lures spirits in from the wider community of the forest. So through their bodily comportment, their intelligence, they're captivating non-human entities and enchanting them. And this movement, this music, is promoting a sense of levity and openness in the body and the mind. There's no kind of, we're thinking here about the Carnesian, the brain in a vat idea. This is the utter opposite. The body has become the mind and the mind the body. The body is a verbal, cognitive entity that's completely overcome any kind of Cartesian division here. There's clearly a connection between collective joy and the engagement of adult men with these scripts. When lines such as "the penis is no competition" or "their testicles are broken" are delivered by a line of oiled, painted, dancing women, the sting is somewhat softened. But the fact is they have been spoken, those words, and the playful challenge has been flooded right out into the public domain. Jerome Lewis describes Ngoku, which is the main dance, the primary dance, according to the informants that were talking to Maureen Finnegan, believed by women to be the most powerful spirit. Ngoku represents the women's collective spirit. It corresponds to a collective spirit of ejengi amongst the men. But each of these collectives, the men's spirit is dangerous to the women's spirit dangerous to the men. When Ngoku is summoned by women into camp, men are expected to retire to their huts or leave the forest. They shouldn't be around. Women and girls link arms, charge up and down the length of the camp, singing Ngoku, Ngoku. Older women lead the songs, most of which focus on sexual insults to men or declaration of women's reproductive and sexual superiority. The female body, in its confrontation with male claims to authority, is the substance of the ritual commentary being elaborated. Yeah. So their songs are "Old Men No Good," "The Testicles Are Broken," there's wide variety, all of them with sexual connotations. But in one performance, Jerome Lewis actually saw the women would lie together on their backs in the dust, rubbing their thighs together until they became frenzied, lifted up from behind one at a time by one of the elder Ngoku initiates. Quite clearly the signalling going on in this dancing. These are not wifely and available women. These are women that are absolutely asserting themselves as collectivity. What we're seeing is a remarkably frank commentary on women's sexual autonomy and inviolability. And more, we could say, I better hurry on, but you're getting the general idea here of worth just saying. When Yaka women dance, they assert their total presence by forming like a branched body. The lyrics of their most prized songs are relishing bodily fluids, appetites, productions. This assertion of bodily meaning makes sense because on a daily business, as a basis of their whole life and the economy and their whole social life, they're so intimately part of each other's skin, they pool as collectively, milk, nurture children. So these performances pivot on a contradiction that emphasises sexual attractiveness on the one hand, but also unavailability at the same time. And it makes, when I read that stuff, and I've listened as well to Chris with his discussion of Chomsky and the brain and the vat and the total Cartesian distinction between mind and body that we were also encountering with that discussion of generative grammar. In my understanding of evolution of language, these are the contexts where language would have come into being. And those original chants, like Ngoku, those original chants, or up yours, or whatever it might be, in that collective context would have been the driving force of generating language and grammar. Ultra opposite. It has been said that the shortest book in the world is what the bawdy humour of Noam Chomsky. This is like the utter extreme to, Chomsky's kind of thinking about this head cut off in the body. This is the the complete driving force opposite of that. Now, I better bring it back to Engels at some stage, and I've only got a few minutes to do so.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you another 5 minutes.
Oh, well, yeah, I'll just try and bring it back, relate it a little bit back to our Engels, because I think if Marx and Engels have heard or knew about this stuff from their position, having digested, going through the tradition from Backhoff and through Morgan, the arguments about group marriage, the early stages of promiscuity, sexual freedom, group marriage, the great discoveries of classificatory kinship, whereby that Lewis Henry Morgan made with the Iroquois and then extended to kinship systems all over the world, whereby a woman's sister basically acts as she does herself, a woman's sister's child is her own child, but that also entails a logic whereby a woman's husband is also her own husband. So we've got this completely communistic attitude and collective attitude to children, to kinship, to marriage, to sex, to everything, the primitive communist idea. And we've said many times in this communist university, Marx and Engels in reading and understanding, as really dialectic revolutionaries, understanding Morgan's work, were some of the original evolutionary ecologists, understanding the evolutionary changes to kinship systems and forms of the family changing through time with different forms of economy and subsistence, from hunter-gatherer through farming, through pastoralism until civilized and so-called civilized societies. And we've also argued in much literature that we published recently, Early Human Kinship, this book, the book on grandmotherhood, we've argued that the whole of 20th century anthropology was basically aimed, and I'm talking about social anthropology especially, with Malinowski as its leader, it aimed to quash and rubbish everything that was discovered by Engels following from Morgan, the anthropology of the late 19th going into the 20th century, which tended, as a generality, to assume, yes, there must have been a matrilineal priority, that matrilineal relations, a matrilineal clan, the matrilineal gens, the matriarchal gens, so-called, would have been the earliest forms of human social organisation, that entailed a great sexual freedom for women, because basically facts about paternity were not known or recognised. What I'll do is just take I'll just have two slides really to see but just to go over a few of the ways in which, even though social anthropology of the 20th century tried its damnedest to rubbish Engels and Morgan, that tradition, actually what's happened is an extraordinary thing, that Darwinian anthropology has vindicated evolutionary ecologists, has to a large degree begun to vindicate the findings or the original ideas and concepts of Engels and Morgan. One of the major ways it's done that has been with the grandmother hypothesis, the idea that the very evolution and origin of human life histories, particularly the long post-reproductive lifespans, this originated because women who had older mothers had extra care for their very young and very slow developing offspring, and it paid, as an evolutionary strategy, it paid women to live longer, to help out their daughters, supporting those offspring. The grandmother hypothesis is now pretty strongly entrenched in life history theory. There's still plenty of people that don't like it, but an increasing amount of literature. I've only given some of the basic references there on the grandmother hypothesis. There's an increasingly wide literature finding examples where, particularly maternal grandmothers, the mother's mother, her presence makes a lot of difference to survivorship of children, whereas paternal grandmothers, depending on the context, but paternal grandmothers can actually often be even they can actually diminish the chances of survival of either mother or offspring, which is pretty strong stuff. Grandmother hypothesis then has been a very large. Why does grandmother hypothesis imply that Morgan and Engels were right? It's implying that earliest origins of human culture and society presumably mothers lived with daughters, and that would have been our sort of the fundamental social division of labour would have started with older women and their daughters. Aspects of hunter-gatherer provisioning, the idea of a kind of communistic household with collectivity of production, even though the communistic household that Engels is describing from Morgan, from the Iroquois, they are hunter-horticulturalists rather than pure hunter-gatherers. But amongst hunter-gatherers, it's a universally accepted. Hunter-gatherers operating any serious amount of meat in the economy, that meat or valued foods like meat or honey, they go collectively around the camp. That situation will only break down when the men who want to hunt large game can no longer find large game, and then they start to have sneaky strategies of trying to get to privatise the hunting. But in the case of the Hadza, for sure, this is not the case. Yeah, I can just go on to the next slide because there's a couple of very other really worthwhile things to mention there. Partible paternity. This is a major new development in the last decade or so. The idea that children do not have in the understanding of the people, they don't have only one father, they may have two or more fathers. And in fact, in groups where that happens, and it's mostly known in South America, but this has been well documented, children who have more than one father are more likely to survive. So the idea of partible paternity is it takes a lot more than one sex act to make a child. It takes a lot of, sex is hard work, you've got to really build up the amount of semen there that will finally coagulate to form a fetus. And that implies that therefore more than one man and a woman in a society of that kind, with an ideology of that kind, will utilise that to be able to pick her mates, and she'll point the finger at, right, you're one of them, and they'll be the most handsome hunter, useful hunters as well as you can do. There, she'll try it on. There is this studies on the partible paternity give us a beautiful, when they're looked at in Amazonian groups, it gives us a beautiful spectrum moving from, on the one end, a fully matrilineal, matrilocal, fully type of what you might have termed matriarchal, but it isn't matriarchal, it's just women's kinship, women controlling the stores in common, just as Engels was describing with the Iroquois, and contributing fathers being lined up by those women and their mums, maybe 3 or 4 at a time, socially sanctioned through ceremony, that it's 3 or 4 guys who are contributing food to any particular offspring. And then the spectrum moves through to all the way to where the kinship is much more contested, and there are actually patrilineal groups, now nominally patrilineal groups, where a woman might have more than one guy as a lover, but if she does, then it doesn't fit into patrilineal, having this partible paternity idea. So there's a relic of the partible paternity idea that it's possible for a child to have more than one father, but if these fathers belong to different lineages, that doesn't fit the ideology. So we've got a kind of spectrum moving from, depending on how much can women stay with their kin, including their brothers in the household as their defenders, going all the way to how much are women kind of controlled, and their sexuality is controlled by men who are part of patrilineal sins. So partible paternity gives us a beautiful picture of a sort of evolutionary trajectory going on between matrilineal and patrilineal. The human revolution we know about, we've spoken about many times here, I can show you all again. The world historic defeat, and the idea that pastoralism, especially if you're reading Engels' text, it's especially farming, private property. If we go back to some of his original statements on the subject, as maybe worth doing, just page 120. It's farming and pastoralism originally. The cow is the enemy of matrilineal is a statement that many anthropologists have asserted, and now that is being well demonstrated by evolutionary ecologists, looking at the way that kinship changes according to subsistence if groups, many Central African groups, subject to tsetse fly, lose their cattle. They may well revert back to virtually matrilineal relations, and women will stay home where their mums are. And the most basic factor being residence, basically. Where does a woman live once she's having sex, once she's married? Does she stay with her mum? Does she stay where her brothers are? Or does she go with a husband? If he's got cattle, can pay a bride price with cattle, she goes with the husband, and the relatives don't really want her back because that implies they have to pay back the cattle. But if there's no cattle, the cattle are useless, they died off with tsetse fly, they want the woman back, they want her children back. And this is now being very clearly demonstrated as a kind of evolutionary sequence. Where did I want to go with all that? I was going to go through our model again, but I think we've kind of said enough. We've said enough about this. This is a model which is driven by requirements of female energetics, and especially related to the increase of brain size of the last 500,000 years. And the model consists of looking at female sexual signaling. If what women need is investment by men, they need men to provide for them, provide extra energy, particularly provide meat foods. How they can influence the situation is by using sexual signals. Why are we seeing these women in Central Africa dancing, alluring the way they are? Is because that is the way to influence men. If you want to prevent men from being aggressive, just piling in there with sheer aggression, then you use other forms of signaling, sexual signaling that are promising and alluring, but are making sure that they're selecting males who are investors, not males who are just going to kind of go in there and grab, kind of philander or rapist strategy. The signal that becomes problematic is menstruation, because it gives away the game about female fertility. So secrets around and ritual around menstruation, so it turns into that. If one female alone is signalling that she's menstruating and the rest of the females are pregnant or lactating or not cycling, the men will be all interested in the one who's menstruating, the females will be interested in the one who's menstruating. So we say that what happened was virtually that. It looks like that. This is amongst the group, pastoralist group. Nevertheless, because they don't really have cows, they have small livestock, the women are able to maintain a great deal of solidarity. We say, what is all this stuff in the matriarchy myths about tricks and turning into animals, the woman with the zebra's penis? Why does the woman have a zebra's penis? Because if women have to say no to sex, then they've got to do the opposite of what a female chimpanzee says when she is very fertile and she's signalling right species, right sex, right time. Women, that's bush women, the Elan bull dance, they're signaling with the wrong species, the wrong sexes at the wrong time, or menstruating. The woman with the zebra's penis in the Hadza is an equivalent of the Elan bull amongst the Bushman groups. The time of the first menstruation is when they dance this. And that's our range of predictions. Predictions that focus on the archaeology of the cosmetics industry, predictions that look at the fossilization and the encephalization rates in the last 500,000 years, and especially predictions about the myths and the lunar cosmologies of hunter-gatherers, which I was reading some of those myths earlier, just to give you a flavour of them. And that's the archaeology of the ochre going back through at least 300,000 years now. And we're picking up quite a lot of some of the ochre trails we've seen and just dash through. Dash through. Okay. We went to the end. Sorry. Just the last little bit, because that's worth picking up. Because that really is where, when we come to look at those stories of the matriarchal myths, or indeed any magical myths, or fairy tales from European traditions, we can find matriarchy myths in fairy tales of Europe. we can line them up and analyse them in intricate detail to decode stories according to this signalling system. The stories are telling of ritual power, and therefore those entities or spirits or tricky women who have ritual power, it's always going to be expressed by one or more combinations of these factors, these waxing moon, associated to the waxing moon signals, because the dark means the time of ritual. And during that period, there should be no sex, or the sex is certainly not marital sex. The sex might be animal sex or spirit being sex, but it's not animal, it's not marital sex. And all these other bleeding, raw, hunger, you can't eat meat in that time, flesh is taboo, relations of kinship and incest. All of this applies to the Wawalak story. The animals refused to be cooked. They jumped into the water hole. The snake is swallowing the women. It's both female and male. It's got gender inversion and gender ambivalence. Nobody's eating anything. The animals don't get eaten. They're hungry. They're being eaten themselves. All flesh is taboo. We have incestuous relations, etc., etc. Whereas this side is describing the happy ever after, the boring bit. It's not particularly interesting. So, okay.
Thanks for that.
You've got a kind of contrast between, say, the Genghis Khan model, where there is an extraordinary spread of Y chromosome lineage that probably comes from Genghis Khan all over practically Eurasia. The very opposite of that occurs in a group like the Hadza, when a huge number of Y chromosome lineages tend to be expressed, which is what we would expect in this situation, where there's a kind of sexual egalitarianism, that any hunter is, through the luck of the hunt, likely to be able to get some sort of crack at the whip. But there's a lot of there's quite a lot of different stories being told on the genetic bottleneck front. That there may be some very much reduced Y chromosome variation at certain points when populations became really, really small and then just made it. If we thought, I haven't really thought about it in terms of the classificatory kinship group marriage scenario, but what we do know is that if you compare genetic variation amongst Central African groups who are farming groups, and I'm thinking of, if you look at their MIT DNA lineage, which is passed only through females, and you look at their Y chromosome, which is through the males, and then you compare that to the hunting groups like that I've been talking about with the Bengele and others. For the hunting groups, women's MIT DNA variation is very, very localized. So women are sticking with their mothers, and you only have to go 5 miles away and you find quite distinctive, you get a lot of MIT DNA variation. And it's the opposite way around with the farmers. And then by contrast, it goes the other way around with the Y chromosome. The Y chromosomes with the farmers, it will be very low, it will be quite localized. With the hunters, the Y chromosomes go way across because men are kind of spreading, they're moving a lot. But because we know so much about genetic lineages in farming, I mean, all of the Eurasia basically has been changed by farming subsistence, which always tends to indicate that MIT DNA lineages, the women get carried far and wide, and the men become very localized. So that kind of thing. So we kind of get different pictures on that. Genetics isn't my strong subject. Okay, so Anne's points about all these different varieties of control of women's sexuality is very, very interesting. Something I've thought a lot about and tried to do some study on as well. Purdah, examples from either Islam or other religions as well, Christianity with chastity belts and so on, control of, and I look at it in terms of control of signals. Are women able to demonstrate or exaggerate signals and amplify cosmetically, or are they forced to stay in places where they're hidden, and therefore the only person who has knowledge about their reproductive cycling will be a particular man who has ownership, or who has control or rights of ownership, which becomes maybe her husband, but they in the first place be her brothers and kin. And this leads to all kinds of cultures of shame and honour, where for a woman to break free of that in any way and to come out and be able to signal away from that is a reflection on the men, to the point where even her own relatives will be prepared to disown and even kill and so on. This is an extraordinary thing, but it shows how powerful the battle over control of that signalling is. It's enormously powerful. The thing with genital mutilation is incredibly complicated. I've seen, we've been talking about some of the examples of the women's battle of the sexes, this pendulum of power going, men do their secrets with their spirit, their ijangi, women come back with their Boku. They're fighting this sort of playful battle of the sexes. And I've seen that in the field with the Hadza, that women's secrets of matriarchal played against men's secrets of epeme. They're never meant to be straying into each other's secrets, but they're always jeering and laughing about, well, I've got these, you've got those. But the women of the Hadza, not the Central African, they do some genital mutilation. And this is nothing to do with men's control of them at all. It is to do, I believe, and my student that's been working with it also, to do with creation of solidarity. This sounds incredibly inverted, but the signals, the collective blood signals, are put into ceremonial cutting and deliberate forms of cutting amongst the women that the women share, that really the older women tend to impose on younger, to bring them into the adult women's community. And a woman who doesn't go through that experience is regarded with distrust by the others. So this is the Huds were famous for their grandmothers, very hardworking and very authoritative grandmothers. And they retain matrilocal matrilineal to an extent that other hunter-gatherers may not do. For instance, Bushmen, the women may let their daughters go eventually with sons-in-law, but the Hadza don't. And part of it is this process of this high-cost, shared suffering. Now, not at all there are different forms of genital mutilation, and there are different parts of Africa's the main focus where they are, but then they extend on other parts of the world too. Some of those forms are really creating bonds and boundaries amongst women's secret societies. Some of those forms are really about men's control of women's fertility, most especially the enclosure, the sewing up in fibrillation type forms. Those are much more to do with a real patriarchal control, whereas other forms, maybe you could envisage it in terms of a sort of trades union strengthening the bonds by paying dues of some sort, that you believe and trust each other because you kind of suffered something together. So those girls' initiations that are going through those are actually creating very powerful. The examples in West Africa of secret societies, places like Liberia, Sierra Leone, for instance, it verges into mafiosi sort of secrecy, some of that. But no, so it's a complicated subject, very much so. But the more that men and men's exploitation of women are placing women's solidarity under pressure, those are the circumstances where we would see a development towards maybe some extreme measures of like genital mutilation. So it is a kind of reflection of the power relations between the sexes, potentially. On the subject of greater cooperation between women, and it goes also to the mention of issues of male physical strength and so forth. But women, as soon as you are entering any form of property, class society, stratification, where some people, which will generally mean men, are able to gain more resources compared to others, women are going to be every bit equally as competitive to tap into those resources by making themselves available or trying to get marriage with those men or whatever, or the investment of those men. Women can be just as easily divided and ruled in terms of competitiveness as men. We see women in class society, women who have a lot of riches and wealth and resources, of course they're equally competitive as men are with women who have much less, and with men who have much less. There's no question about that. But if we're looking at a situation which is coming out of a sort of primate evolutionary past, where the property is not the issue, there is only abilities and resources of fertility versus ability to garner food. There may be some ability to accumulate food, but it's not that lasts, that goes into any serious degree of poverty. In those circumstances, and this talks to the situation that Mark's referring to with his food riot situations, in those circumstances there's a kind of base rock level where women will have more to share in terms of interest, where their ability to share, cooperate because they have shared interests concerning getting hold of resources to feed kids. And the forest hunter-gatherers are absolutely showing this at the most fundamental level. They breastfeed each other's kids. They just share all the food around. There's no way that they're going to let that kind of stuff divide them, even if there might be a little bit of, I fancy him compared to you, and you fancy my guy. And even that will get quashed because there is such a reliance on being able to share and work together on getting resources. And in the situations that Mark's talking about, that sort of thing is coming through. When you're at a base rock level, you've got to get the resource, you've got to be able to feed the kids. And whereas with men in that kind of transitional primate to human scenario, the issue of sexual competition is always just going to make them tend to be, they're not going to be the first ones to cooperate. They will cooperate if women cut their options off. And in those circumstances, women will have more chance they do a divide and rule on men too. They divide their own kin, their brothers, away from their husbands. They keep hold of their brothers to support them. And their marital partners are sort of kept at arm's length, and they come and they go, and they're not integrated totally into these matriarchal households. 1 minute. I can't go through all this.
You can tell me at the end.
Yeah. I've got another. But there's lots and lots of interesting questions. How many of these are going to go? So I said something I wanted to say more to Mark's thing actually, because the examples in I know a lot of this material from places like West Africa. When you said that about the Spanish women actually starting to do naked strips and stuff like that in front of the police, this is something that's really important for thinking about the revolution. I'm not saying at all that for thinking about how to create revolution, it's got to be a women-only operation. That's not going to be true. But there is sure as hell going to be room for women-only action and space that's women-only and space that's generating, women's strategies, with which men will be highly cooperative and necessary allies. But the use of things, stripping naked, mooning, being the kind of extension of this sexual teasing and bawdiness as a direct challenge to, you do not have authority over us. And the impact on any man that's a human man, and this is so often played in West Africa to this day, to actions inside oil terminals, to actions inside Yarl's Wood in the detention centre. Women of West African descent use these kinds of strategies. That men are just shamed. They can't touch it. They're being called to a fundamental human level where if they try and violate that kind of stuff, it's just inhuman. They can't do it. So this is the sort of thing that Green and Common women were playing on when the police were finding it really difficult to deal with women-only actions. How do we deal with this? It's different from using physical violence in picket line situations with strikers who are male, and it's just a different scenario. And talking to that issue about male violence, it cannot ever work as pure male violence. The New Guinea situations and the Aboriginal Australian situations and so on has always, and the Epeme of Hadza have always got that threat of the male violence erupting and imposing itself. But those men know that if culture is to be preserved, it has to be in the name of some legitimate, authoritative ritual power. And that comes down to these secrets of the menstruation and so on. So that the New Guinea men, it really is a rule of terror and violence, the threat to what would happen to women who made incursion into males' initiation secrets. But it all has to be veiled by this kind of apparent legitimacy for the men by having these secrets. There would be much to say about I don't know about stories about sodomy, but there's plenty of practice that is definitely verging on homosexual, from African initiation, from Papua New Guinea initiation especially. No question about that, and there would be more to say about it. I think, Nick, you kind of answered your own question about the history. The myths are fundamentally historic. Whether they're telling us real historic details, it's like, Peter Gow's book. It's an issue of the syntax is giving us something that kind of goes right the way through time, and it's very hard to tease apart what's myth and what's history. But if we know the syntax and know what the kind of the basic structure is, we've got a little more chance of being able to say, well, when historically would these particular kind of contradictions have arisen? For instance, a story like Wives of Sun and Moon that Chris has analysed, which is evidently showing something about a transition towards a patrilocal agricultural system from former maybe hunting lifestyles. Okay, what else? About male takeover issues, big man issues. Oh my God, I can't say it all.
You will get about 10 or 15 minutes in.
At the end anyway.
I've got three more contributions. I just thought it was nice it's good to have so much to deal with.
Let me come back to the politics today and the lunarchy and the male takeover maybe. Okay. I agree with you, Mark, really. This is quite critical, that in some ways represents a return on a higher level to the kinds of problems of production and the energetics of production and reproduction that were there in the time period, the last 500,000 years, with the brain size increase going so rapidly. Especially the attack on, working class mothers who were desperate to make ends meet, to feed children. How do they actually look after their children and also get pushed out to work, shoved out, made to go to work before they can be the children okay? So that sort of thing, where's their jobs to go to, homes to go, all of that is critical. And yes, in the original revolution, it was about instead of women doing all the work of reproduction and production, which was effectively the situation with, grandmother is starting to help the mother by doing some of the work. That's really our first division of labour. Grandmother starts to be a producer that takes some of the burden of childcare off her daughter, and that starts to generate a cooperative breeding system. And men start to get into that because a woman who's got a mother helping her is going to be fertile more frequently. She's just worth latching onto for that reason. And that man doesn't have to have any notion of paternity necessarily. He just has to be helping out and getting more mating chances by doing that. Then that kind of works as a complex that would generate our matriarchal clans in the very earliest stages. But it doesn't create culture as such until we get this women's collectivity and real communism of production and reproduction, and getting the men out there to start being very productive. Tina's talking about asking about the male takeover scenarios. It does go to things like pastoralism as an absolute classic of patriarchal takeover in class society. But some of those stories I was reading from places like Papua New Guinea, where the exploitation of women as a class, effectively, they're not just doing the babies, but they're doing all the work of raising particularly valued sources of protein like pigs, effectively for their husbands and his patrilineal clans, patriclans, to be able to produce ritual feasts, to be able to create networks of alliances where it is met. So the women are absolutely being taken away from their family. They come to where the men are. They're actually tribal enemies of the men. They don't even speak the same language necessarily, and they're virtually being used as, I mean, it's not slavery exactly, though, because they maintain certain collectivity and ritual of resistance, but it is almost a class oppression that they're doing all the work, both of reproduction and production, and that is enabling men to play the contest for alliances, for being able to gain more wives. The more that one wife works and produces pigs, the more they can start to gain more wives, the more it starts to be a situation of accumulation. I'm always going to come back to being Darwinian at some level. We are the species where Darwinism has produced effective egalitarianism, communism. That is a scenario which, Simon's saying, even amongst matrilineal, matrilocal groupings that might come the closest to being called matriarchal, if women are picking and choosing, they're going to pick and choose the men that kind of deserve it, and sort of, well, fair play. The men who are investing the most and doing the most hunting, it's kind of fair play to them. The more they do that, the more that goes around, the more there's a kind of fair distribution. But very, very quickly, as soon as there's any sort of property accumulation and some corner more resources, the skew of reproduction goes in the direction of the guy who's just got that extra resources, and the females will flock. We're going to be bad about it. We will flock there unless there are incredible, powerful cultural taboos in place. What do we say about politics today? And why do I resist matriarchy and how does this come to your human nature thing? Fundamental of human nature, to the extent that the energetics problem weighed down on women, would be what I was describing in these women's resistance is the aspect of counter-dominance. Counter-dominance, resistance to being dominated, is something that I really think we say is fundamental to human nature as compared with, say, primates, where whether you're looking at monkeys like macaques or looking at chimpanzees and apes, basically there are examples where females will come out with resistance to male dominance when they're getting absolutely fed up with obnoxious male behaviour. But in general terms, they'd rather settle for the big sort of Saddam Hussein male who can keep the peace and side with him and let him keep the peace for them so they can just get on with their lives. They'd be quite happy with that. Whereas counter-dominance is this very persistent aspect. And the other aspect of human nature, the materials that Tomasello has shown with his studies of the kids compared with his studies of the chimps, are just our automatic ability to cooperatively share attention. Our eyes are the dead giveaways, that we have evolved in a trajectory which must be generated from the cooperative breeding system heritage of grandmother strategies. That we're prepared and willing to cooperate with each other to a level that just doesn't exist with our closest relatives amongst apes. The Neanderthals, would they have had eyes like ours? Would they have been cooperative communists? Yeah, I would guess so. I can't believe that they would have, with the evidence that's coming out on their cosmetics now, I would see that their strategies must be of the similar type. But maybe there were problems that were never fully resolved in Neanderthal environments to the same degree of persistence in the speciation. We're not allowed to talk about two different species now because there does seem to be some interbreeding. So we've got to say Neanderthal populations and modern populations. Okay, I'll give you. But maybe in the modern circumstance and environment that they evolved, these strategies, just for the ritual strategies, became a far more persistent part of the nature of the species like that population And with Neanderthals, the differences between glaciations and interglaciations may have done a sort of stop-start on things in a much different way. Is a bit of a tenuous argument. But I believe that Neanderthals had eyes like ours and were fundamentally cooperative species. I doubt they could have done the stuff that they did with hunting unless that was a fundamental basis. Politics today still matriarchy, lunarchy. The teachings of those hunter-gatherer groups is saying we do need to have battles of the sexes, and we do need to have fun with those battles of the sexes, and there needs to be this kind of pendulum swing whereby we take over and then we lose, surrender, and then we take over and we surrender, something like that. Every economics is an economics of time, as Marx says. When we were out there on the Democracy Village, it was all very paradoxical because we had this great big clock, this great big Ben up with its face, counting down, like capitalist timekeeping, the minutes of the day. And of course, clocks and minutes and hours are all developments of capitalist of wage-earning economies to make workers clock on, clock off, clock on, clock off, to apportion and count the money, the pennies for their time. Yet, being out there in Democracy Village, which is about the most counter-dominant, world-turned-upside-down environment that could ever be in the heart of a big city today, the sky, we were open to the sky, and were knowing when the moon or the light in the sky would make it. This would make a difference to what life was like out there during the night, even in the middle of London where the lights are. The fundamental rhythm that belongs to human nature, because it is natural, is a rhythm in time of lunar cycles, and that belongs to the bodies of half the human race. And it counts the menstrual cycles and pregnancy as a multiple of that. And so, yes, if we are going to combat this alienation that's taken us away from our fundamental cooperative, fundamentally communist, fundamentally counter-dominant natures, then resorting again to instituting measures of time that recognise lunar rhythm, and doing that in ways that are empowering, ritualising. So doing away with borders in space and replacing them with borders in time would be, I think, a very huge part of any revolutionary programme. And it has to be woman-led. It doesn't mean it isn't male-allied. It has to be woman-led in some sense. So that's why I call myself lunarchist. That's why I don't like matriarchy so much, because it's got an idea of there is one sex ruling over another, whereas if we say lunarchist, it's not one sex ruling over, it's a pendulum swing. That at one stage the sexes disaggregate, at one stage they come back together as marital, and it kind of shifts the power between the two all the time. Now, what other questions? The classical questions were really interesting, and what you said about Oedipus and Theseus and the sirens suddenly realised. That strikes me as we get these stories in Central Africa, in kingship stories, that the women with the knowledge pass it down to. The knowledge may be taken by initiate males in the first place, but when kingdoms arise, there are these particular males who the knowledge that matters the most is knowledge about women's fertility and secrets. And the Fraser had those ancient observations about menstrual maidens and kings, but this sirens thing is almost surely speaking to something like that. There would be lots to say. I'm very interested to hear you say what Kekrops was. That was where the story. He's the serpent on the Acropolis, isn't he? He's related to the. He appears as a serpent, doesn't he? Am I right?
I have to look it up.
I go back to Jane Ellen Harrison, but because of course the maidens, the Athenian maidens, would do the feeding of the serpent by the month with the honey cakes. Yes. It was this famous women's ritual, and there's absolutely no doubt there's a whole collection of women's rituals. They would buy lunar calendars in the Athenian calendars. Thesmophoria is obviously the major one, which is women's takeover of male political space. It's like the Greek Christmas. suddenly the politics is everybody goes home from the assembly, and women come and do their incredible bloody, earthy rituals, which are menstrual solidarity rituals with mothers and daughters and kin rituals. So they really take over men's political space with their rituals. That really still existed. Right, with other serious questions that I want to say. Serious criticisms. Some people try to say all that red ochre is utilised for other reasons than paint. They really, really want to not say it's paint. And that it's and then if they say, oh, it's just paint, oh, it's just a bit of colour, it doesn't have any symbolic significance. They try very hard to do that. But I think the Neanderthal finds have blown them out of the water. The Neanderthal finds are showing that when we get to any level of cultural, any indication of cultural coordination in these ancient early human societies, Neanderthals or moderns, cosmetics is the lead edge. Cosmetics is what counts. The revolutions are fundamentally about cosmetics. And so that starts to be special pleading. Serious criticisms? Oh, help me here. What were they being able to say?
The thing is that anyone prepared to read our stuff, that usually gets up in completely converted on the other one.
The pinker stuff about men always want to have single male jealousy would prevent all this. Men always want to keep on to their women, and they're too violent anyway. They never let women go on sex club, and it's that sort of thing is, it's from people who just don't know enough. It's other serious things. The main thing now is that there's a big movement against calling it human revolution. There's a movement to seeing a much more gradual early beginnings from 500,000 years ago, particularly with the Neanderthals. So Jean Gillau is the main champion of the Neanderthal material, will say, oh, that rubbish is the human revolution. But so the human revolution is a process or a strategy, strategies of counter-dominance and strategies of being able to get the investment and get the productivity out of males. So it doesn't have to happen overnight, and even if it happens once overnight, it can be a persistent and repeated pattern. And that's probably what does explain the record of sort of 500 to 200,000 years ago, before something finally breaks through as a completely sort of onto a level where it can't go back. Becomes firm, it can't go back anymore. Yeah. And that could be explained by all kinds of demographic processes. It would be too difficult to.
Just say Jean Gillau is giving a talk at RAG.
Yeah, he's come and hear him at RAG and
but the title is Why the Human Revolution Theory is Wrong. Big cheese, and the main expert on the Neanderthals really.
No, he's the main man, and he's going to have a big interview in our Radical Anthropology magazine.
So he's the most serious critic that's standing at the moment, or is he?
Well, because he's been Maverick, who's stuck his neck out in resistance to recent African origins, saying yes, Neanderthals bred with us, and Neanderthal industries, the Shadowpleurodoniju of Europe, were leading edge, not copying. They were the leading edge and influenced the moderns coming in, and he's being well validated and vindicated. And I'm more power to him. As far as I'm concerned, why shouldn't the Neanderthals have been?
But he's not trying to put the big picture together. He's interested in some things,
but he's not very friendly to behavioural ecology or Darwinism. He's a cultural and archaeologist. So we think we've got things to say to him about that. Now, what else? Anything I left out? Nah.